Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone dialing in today. I'm so delighted to be your moderator for the next hour, taking us through our exciting panel around putting skin in the game. So the economic opportunity model. I know we've had several other sessions over the course of yesterday and today talking about some other topics, but today we're really going to hone in on the business side and the economic arguments around investment in women's health and inclusivity in gender research. So I have quite an impressive group of panelists joining me today. And in the benefit of virtual times, you actually have access to their bios, I believe, in this portal as well as online. So rather than ask my panelists to go through all of their backgrounds, I'm going to ask each of them to share 3 things with you today. I will start with an answer to give them time to think as well. Your name, where you are calling in from today, and then the best thing you've watched or read over the last 12 months. So to get us started, I will go first. I am Jennifer Friel Goldstein. I work for SVB Capital. Today I am Zooming, webinaring in from the Bay Area. And I was thinking about this last night. I think my favorite thing watched over the last 12 months was The Queen's Gambit, which I just really, really adored. So hopefully we have some other fans of that show as well. Let's go through the audience here. First up in my boxes, let's go with Nola.
Hi, I'm Nola Masterson. Today I'm calling you from my home in Woodside, California, which is next to Stanford University. And the best thing that I have seen this year was David Attenborough's updated A Life on Planet Earth. I urge everyone to see it to get a real wake-up call for what's happening to planet Earth now.
Great one. We did watch that as a family. So thank you, Nola. Rob, I have you up next in my Hollywood Square boxes.
Hey, good morning. Rob Califf here, calling in from Durham, North Carolina. And the best thing I've seen in the last year was my indoor Mother's Day dinner with no one having to wear a mask and everyone fully vaccinated, including the 2 17-year-old grandkids.
Now, that is quite a milestone after the year we've had. So I think many people are starting to be able to enjoy those celebrations. That's a good one. All right, Carolee.
Hi, I'm Carolee Lee, and I am calling in from Greenwich, Connecticut, where I'm at my office. And I happen to love Queen's Gambit, and I also loved Attenborough's piece. So both of those, but I must say that the most impressive thing that I've read this year is the WHAM report, which I'll be talking about, because it corroborates all of the instincts and good ideas that we all had to accelerate women's health.
That was great, and we will most definitely be talking about that later. So thank you for mentioning that now. Anula?
Hi, I'm Anula Jayasuriya. I'm calling in from the Boston area. And I, too, have to say the WHAM report, specifically the section, the module on cardiac disease and women, is astounding. And stay tuned. You'll get to read it soon, too. And then also, I loved Homegoing, which was an absolutely wonderful novel.
Excellent, thank you. And last but not least, Faz.
Hi everyone, I'm Faz Bashi. I'm in San Francisco, and I was going to see The Queen's Gambit and also David Attenborough's presentation. I think one of my favorite books this year is John Hagel's The Power of Pull, so I would highly recommend taking a look at that.
That is great, and I have not read that, so now I have some new recommendations. So thanks, everyone. To get us started, I'm going to kick off the session really focused on the title of the session, which is Putting Skin in the Game. That was a purposeful choice. Nola, I'm going to start this question over to you. As we begin to think about the industry of women's health and gender inclusivity in scientific research, how do we think about that from an economic perspective?
Well, thanks, Jennifer. You know, it's really time to pay serious attention to women's wallets and women's wants. And this is sometimes referred to as the she economy in some circles, because women's influence is rapidly growing. And that is to be underscored by the fact that there is a growing purchasing power that women have. Women's economic buying power has grown from 18 trillion in 2014 to a forecast of 24 trillion in 2020. And compare that to the China's GDP of 16 trillion in 2020, or the United States 22 trillion for the GDP for 2020. Women-owned businesses registered worldwide represent 40% of businesses today, and 37% of high net worth individuals globally are women, and that totals 20% of the total wealth of the world. Women in Africa make up 70% of the agricultural production workforce. 80% of household healthcare spending is done by women, and women are 90% of primary healthcare decision makers for families and key influences for their friends. So, with this growth in spending power, women are making a major impact on what they want to see in the world. The largest impact is in attention to health solutions, especially heretofore unaddressed women's health issues. The burst in research, products, and services to solve women's health issues are the work of a fast-growing FemTech industry. This includes devices, products, software, platforms, and services, and any combination of those technologies that address women's health and wellness that's concerned throughout their lifespan. The range is wide, including disease detection, reproductive health, cancers, general health, pregnancy care, and healthy active aging. The innovation is focused on solving problems in promising ways. Some ideas are new, and others are based on reimagining better solutions to traditional products in the market today. Examples of issues addressed are early detection for ovarian cancer, which was done by Envision, started by a woman. Protection from anemia and ovarian and endometrial cancer, which is being done by Pandia Health, another woman startup. Replacing radiation exposure from mammograms with saliva tests to assess precision medicine in cancer with biomarkers done by Prime Genomics. Award-winning bioelectric treatment for sinus pain and sinus congestion to replace medicine, which was started by Tivic Health and Jennifer Ernst. Also, early digestive health of babies and toddlers with new research-based diet changes to vegetable-based foods called Fresh Bellies. And early detection of seizures by Easy, Dr. Raquel Cooperman. So the FemTech market is under watch as the next big disruptor, Jennifer, and it's projected to be $50 billion industry in 2025. This growth is from 42 million in 2018 to a forecast of 50 billion by 2020. It's going to be fueled by newly emerging global investments that comprise in part new female entrances into investment communities. Trish Costello, who started Portfolia, where Faz and I are lead investors, established the investment designed for women to back innovative companies for both returns and impact on priorities women hold dear. She noted that if a woman wants specific companies in the world that address their needs, the only way to do that is for women to become the investors. The potential of this market is dramatic. As women are both consumers and investors in the solution that meet their needs, this will be an important industry to support for a long time to come. These emerging companies need top talent and professional services to help them improve the quality of life for people in the world, and we support all of this in the industry to ensure that they grow and reach their goals. Our observation is that women mean business. It's smart to pay attention to support the significant impact in the industry. And the bottom line is women have incredible spending power, and women's health is now significantly underfunded, and it's time to make investments in women's health a priority.
That was an exceptional overview to get us started, Nola. Thank you for that. Would any of the audience members like to chime in on some of those themes? I love that you phrased a few things there around FemTech, certainly beyond just reproduction, and also the role that women play in both financing these companies, but also with their purchasing power. Anula, is there something you were going to chime in here?
I want to emphasize some of the things that Nola talked about, which is investing in this space and the importance of understanding how innovations and research become products that women can use. And that is a very important part of this value chain that I'll talk about a little bit later.
That's great. Well, continuing on with our economic thread here, I'm actually going to ask Carolee to jump in here as well, who, you mentioned the WHAM report, we will talk about that. This is a complex set of decision makers, stakeholders to move these technologies forward. How does collaboration work, and what is its role in really optimizing an outstanding return on investment in this space? And tell us what you've learned in this WHAM report.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, for that. And thank you, Nola, for the very insightful and prodigious comments. I'm going to piggyback a little bit on that and start with the fact that I'm honored, of course, for the opportunity to join you here today at such an esteemed gathering, especially honoring Vivian Pinn, and as well as the great vision of Dr. Jean Clayton and the support of FNIH. So thank you all. Let me start with a little data. Women, as Nola pointed out, drive the U.S. economy. And actually, they drive global economies. And in the U.S., women are the majority of the population. They're nearly 50% of the workforce. They control over 60% of all personal wealth in the U.S., and they're responsible, as Nola pointed out, for 85% of consumer spending. Women also make over 80% of healthcare decisions for their families, which Nola also signaled. Yet, let me remind us all that as we talk about putting skin in the game, how stark the gender gap in health research funding still is right now, even across disease areas that impact women disproportionately. So as an example, 12% of Alzheimer's research goes to projects focused on women when 66% of Alzheimer's patients are women. 7% of rheumatoid arthritis research goes to projects focused on women, although roughly 75% of patients are women. And just 4% of cardiovascular disease research goes to projects focused on women, even though women continue to have worse heart attack outcomes than men with much higher mortality rates. In 2018, a group of significant business women wanted to change this scenario, and WHAM was created to make a significant investment that hopefully will help everyone put more skin in the game. We invested in understanding the economic case for funding research focused on women and for collaboration. We asked, what are the economic impacts of increasing investment in women's health research? And we commissioned the RAND Corporation to model the answer. The WHAM report shows us clearly that women's health research isn't just better science, it's a better investment. Increasing funding, even by small amounts, produces big returns for women, families, businesses, and for our economy. Until now, to the very best of our knowledge, no one has evaluated the economic consequences of the status quo, the costs we incur, and the benefits we leave on the table when women are underrepresented in research. We're also very sensitive to the issues of diversity and healthcare disparities, and we applaud the NIH for their new institute-wide initiative known as Unite. This is a very important part of our focus. The WHAM report finds a higher rate of return on investment for research focused on women across our initial disease areas: cardiovascular disease, autoimmune, and Alzheimer's disease. Increasing funding by small amounts will drive billions of dollars to the economy through greater quality of life, workforce and economic gains, and reduced more healthcare costs. For example, we found doubling funding for women's Alzheimer's disease research pays for itself 3 times over. A $300 million investment generates $930 million or 224% return. For every dollar invested, we get back $2 in quality of life improvement and $1.24 in healthcare cost savings. We haven't yet released our findings from heart and autoimmune research, but I'm going to preview the results here for you because they're so significantly larger than we ever estimated. When we double investment for women's heart research, every dollar generates $95 to the economy. And for the rheumatoid arthritis, every dollar generates over $1,700. That makes perfect sense if you think about it, as heart and autoimmune disease take women out of the workforce much earlier on average than Alzheimer's. The WHAM report shows us powerful information across three very different areas at the same time, so that we can see clearly that this issue is not limited to one space. The report speaks to researchers, economists, funders, advocates, policymakers, investors, business leaders, and more. And we're having conversations, multidisciplinary platforms and forums that bring these different leads together across disease verticals and discipline silos. Collaboration is one of the key ways that we're going to make change. Our lead partners include Bright Focus Foundation, which just announced its largest yet annual research investment in Alzheimer's disease, the American Heart Association, which of course is a powerhouse across funding and advocacy and outreach, and the La Jolla Institute for Immunology, which not only is leading on critical COVID research, but just announced that a brilliant woman scientist, Dr. Erica Ullman-Sapphire, will become the Institute's first female CEO and president. And of course, the Connor Center at Brigham and Women's Hospital has been WHAM's lead scientific partner since we began this journey, and we thank them all. We all know that precision medicine is the future, and we can't have precision medicine without studying sex and gender. WHAM is continuing to catalyze funding for women's health research across the board. Beyond quantifying costs and benefits, the WHAM report is an accountability index for change. I'm going to end where I started, and it's similar to Nola's comments. Women are the majority of the population. Women are nearly 50% of the workforce. Women control over 60% of all personal wealth in the U.S. Women are responsible for 85% of consumer spending in the U.S. Think about these numbers and the women behind them. Imagine knowing what we know now about the economic impact of improving and equalizing women's health research. How could we possibly continue to make decisions based on information that excludes the majority of our population? Half our workforce, 2/3 of our wealth holders, and nearly all of our spenders. We can't, and we shouldn't. We hope the WHAM report will be a new platform, a new roadmap to create the kind of lasting change that we all know is right for the well-being of our society. I thank you so much for the opportunity to share this data with you.
Carolee, that was amazing, and I'm sure everyone is now very looking up online. How do they get the WHAM report? Where do they find more information? So do you want to just share a little bit for our audience how they can learn more?
Thank you for reminding me, Jennifer. TheWHAMreport.org.
Very easy. Okay. Hopefully everybody is opening new tabs. New tabs in your browser as we speak. Thank you for that. And you brought up a lot of very important, especially economic drivers for why this is a sector that we want to see more advancement in. I'm actually going to turn it over to Anula to talk a little bit more around, you need a lot of different parties playing in harmony with one another to move science through from academia ultimately to providers who can treat patients. Talk to us a little bit about that spectrum and how those handoffs work, especially in light of what we've just heard about the strong economic rationale for getting more involvement at each one of those steps.
Thanks, Jennifer. So I applaud the organizers for having this panel, because for me, that in itself is a sign that there is acknowledgement and understanding of this ecosystem that I'm just going to talk about, and I'm going to obviously amplify and echo the things that Nola and Carolee have just spoken about. So NIH is about science, and the science gets funded, we get innovations, and how does that get into the hand of a patient? There are many steps in between, and Jennifer was referring to this as a handoff. And so let me say, so from the science and the innovation, it has to be translated, that's the term used, to making the science into something that's potentially clinically relevant. There are clinical trials and a lot of money that's spent there. And then there has to be an entrepreneur or a business, like a industry, a company, a pharma company, a med tech company, or an entrepreneur who comes and says, oh, this looks interesting. Let me see if I can make this into a product. And then that is where Nola, Faz, and I come in. We are venture capitalists. So my bias is very much on the role of venture capital as a stimulus for getting innovation that starts with good science into the hands of patients. So one problem is that only 2 or 6%, the number is small, single digit, are women. And Nola talked about this. And so there's already a bias in looking at innovations and entrepreneurs, and then very few are female entrepreneurs, mostly male. So there is an unconscious bias in the kinds of problems that are funded and the kinds of science that's picked up for becoming interventions. So that is a node that we want to change. We also want to boost the amount of science on women, so there's a bigger pool to choose from. And then what happens next is that it goes, if the product is a drug, for example, it goes through regulation, which Rob knows a whole lot about. So that's the FDA. And then from there, it has to be commercialized. And usually with venture capital companies, the commercialization is done mostly by big pharma or industry. So, and for venture capitalists to give back money to their investors, there needs to be an exit, aka an acquisition of this technology and commercialization. Now, most of the acquirers are also headed by male CEOs. So there again, there is a bias. Now, we're very, very fortunate today to see a reversal of these patterns in that suddenly and thankfully, women's health is hot. I am so glad to see that day. And Faz and Nola and I, as venture capitalists, are also very glad to see that day because we've been trying to make the economic case for ages as to why one should be looking at women's health. Together with Carolee's economic case and a business case, which are related but not exactly the same, we see more and more industry looking at women's health and buying companies in women's health. And this is a virtuous cycle because the more companies that get acquired, then more the entrepreneurs want to come up with innovations that will help patients. So this is the whole chain, and every single node on that chain has had a paucity of women's voices and influence. And we need to intervene everywhere along that chain to boost every single node in order to get the whole ecosystem in women's health going. And so I will stop there and say that we are in a very good place for women's health. This message must be amplified and echoed and understood and appreciated. And the economic and business case are what drives economies. And those are, in my biased opinion, where there has been the least understanding in recent years. And yet, I think there is a very exciting grassroots kind of movement. The pull for women's health didn't start in pharma or the big companies or in industry. It started with people, women speaking up. And this has become converted into a movement that other people are now listening to, like the big influence of pharma and medtech and diagnostic companies. So it is a very exciting time. I'm thrilled to be here right now and very optimistic about where we're going. Thank you.
That was a tremendous overview. Thank you so much for walking the audience through that. And I couldn't agree more that we need to think about more representation sort of at every step along that value chain. And as investors, it's our job to look for unmet medical need and large market potential. And I think we've highlighted that there is both in this space. So I also am very excited to see further investment on the venture capital side, certainly a focus area for me personally. But the venture piece, as Anula mentioned, is one part of the value chain, but there's other things that wrap around that have to do with policy. And so I'm actually going to turn it over to Rob now, who we haven't heard from yet. Both Rob and Foz have been waiting patiently, so I'm going to turn it over to Rob. Talk a little bit about the role policy, and when I say policy, I really mean governmental policy or academic sort of funding, plays in shaping sex and gender inclusion in research, because that is the top of the funnel of the value chain we just spoke about. Could you spend a couple of minutes talking to us about that and how we get greater representation through policy?
Sure, and it's good to be with the group. It's a pretty eloquent group, so I don't think I can really hold a candle compared to what others have said, but I'll put forth a few ideas, and maybe some of these might be a little controversial that could stimulate discussion. The way you frame the question, I'll stick to health policy. There are obviously a lot of other aspects of policy that actually affect health more than health policy, really. Economic policy, for example, really important now that we understand the social determinants of health outweigh the biological determinants for most of people's lives. But in the health policy arena, the center in the U.S. is obviously HHS, Health and Human Services. That includes the FDA, the NIH, the CDC, CMS, and multiple other groups within HHS that play a big role in sort of setting the swim lanes by which research and product sales and dispersion occur. And, I had a chance to be FDA commissioner for a time and learned a lot. And, I like the saying, which puts a heavy weight of responsibility on groups like the FDA. When you realize the FDA regulates about 20% of the economy, and it was said that the FDA can create an entire industry just by changing a rule. And I do think that, in fact, is a reality, and I could give a lot of examples where that's happened. But what I'd like to do is just make a couple of points about the policy related to inclusion. And I think we've made a lot more progress than most people realize or even talk about in most of the meetings that I'm in. During my time in the Obama administration, there was an intense focus on enrollment in clinical trials. And in fact, the NIH instituted policies, and if you look at the overall enrollment in clinical trials funded by the NIH today, the majority of participants are women. If you look at the FDA, which has a special issue that I'll get to in a minute relating to U.S. and global concerns, the best data are kept on drugs which make it to market. And in those drugs that have made it to market in the last 6 years, the majority of participants have also been women. And so, to some extent, compared to where we were 10 years ago, where women were excluded very often, not only are women included, but we sort of hit the overall target that people had set. Now, as I think everybody knows, there's a public accountability here. It's not uniform, so there's still work to do in particular diseases to get representation according to sex. But we also have a long way to go in terms of gender, which several of the speakers have referred to. And just the realization that sex and gender are not the same thing raises a whole bunch of issues that still need to be addressed and are very important in the research arena and in our society. In addition to that, of course, sex is not the only differentiator of demographics or other characteristics. We live in a multidimensional, complex world where there are many issues of disparity and inclusion that need to be addressed. And now that we've sort of hit the basic target for enrollment, we need to get to the next level. For example, understanding what it means when you have a representative subset of a population about drawing conclusions about whether the treatment effect is different or whether the therapeutic or the diagnostic should actually be used differently, because studies are typically sized just to get the overall effect. And if you wanted to look at just a subgroup by sex, you would need to more than double the sample size to draw a reliable inclusion. And that raises a number of issues, especially when you think about all the other dimensions that also have to be thought about. We have the issue of the global world. So the NIH has a lot of control because it gives grants paid for by the taxpayer. And, for example, a really important policy that was instituted was often stopping enrollment in clinical trials when enrollment was not balanced according to sex, and then, enrolling only the minority of the group until the balance was achieved. That's become a normal policy in many clinical trials. But the FDA has a different problem. It's dealing with a global industry where making rules that only pertain to the U.S., it's understandable. This is where I live, and as FDA commissioner, I was concerned about the U.S., but in a global world, what if we instituted the same rules for every country, particularly related to issues of race and ethnicity? There are hundreds of thousands of ethnic groups around the world that need to be considered. And so that gets a little more dicey, but yet it's still the case that if you look at enrollment in the U.S. of drugs that have come on the market in the last 6 years, we've done pretty well in terms of male and female enrollment. And then a couple of other issues which I think are really important, and several of the other speakers have alluded to this, but I think there are special issues with women that are almost completely unaddressed right now. And I would point to two that really ought to be taken care of soon. One is pregnancy. About half of women take a pharmaceutical drug during pregnancy, often because of significant diseases, not just for comfort. And for the most part, there are no clinical trials that have been done in pregnant women. And so we're guessing as to whether the treatment is safe. And in fact, the label says don't do it because the studies haven't been done, but there's no other option. So we need a set of policies that enable us to do the right studies in pregnant women, both for the sake of pregnant women and also the future children. And the other was mentioned, if you look at aging per se, there's a big surplus of women in the older age groups and not nearly enough research. If you go to long-term care facilities now, the vast majority of inhabitants are women. They're there for life for the most part. And we don't know that much about the best treatments because research is not focused in that area. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention, just to make a point, which I hope will be discussed, being the object of study does not guarantee that it will result in better health. And I'll give you the case example, which is men. So men have been the object of study for a long time, and yet women outlive men by 5 years, and the difference is growing, not getting smaller. And so I'm a big proponent of studying differences according to sex and gender and other characteristics. But at least where diseases affect people in common, I think we can learn a lot more by being all-inclusive and then looking at the differences in addition to the similarities. And I think policies that are currently in place are pushing us in that direction. And I hope we'll have more and more public accountability and transparency towards that end.
So you've given us a lot to be hopeful for. And I think the panelists, coupled with, the economic opportunity, WHAM bringing new data to life to help people make decisions, policy starting to have an impact and moving things in the right direction. We see the power the policy can have. It trickles all the way through that value chain with some of those decisions. As much as we like to talk about how much we have yet still to do, we've highlighted some wins, and we shouldn't not do that. It's really important for us to think about the progress that has been made and the path that we're going down. I'd like to pause and see if any of the other panelists would like to comment on some of Rob's perspective about the role policy plays in shaping how some of the economic actors participate in this ecosystem. Go ahead.
I have a question about you talked about the clinical trials being predominantly women or majority women. Much of the data, however, isn't analyzed about men and women separately. And so I think even though now, thank goodness, there are more women in clinical trials, and I think it's a little bit distorted because of the female-only studies. And if you took the female-only studies, which are reproductive health primarily, out, I don't know. I haven't done that. I don't know if it's going to be mostly women. But even if it were, I think you're losing a lot of the information by not requiring that men and women be studied separately. And as the way I understand it, there is a lot of encouragement for doing it, but there is it is often not done because one is able, as let's say as industry, not to do that by saying that, by giving various reasons that are not necessarily very compelling to me as to why one can't do that. So I'm just wondering about how one might make it a little bit harder to get out of that recommendation.
Well, again, just not to be argumentative, but I would say that if you look at NIH-funded studies or studies submitted to the FDA, I'm not aware of a single study that doesn't look at the interaction of sex and outcome as a factor. But what is being referred to is that often those data are not published in the peer-reviewed literature in that way. And so there's a gap in terms of the public's awareness and knowledge of what those studies may show. Probably not surprising that for the most part, the treatment effects tend to be similar, but when they're different, it's really important. And so your point's well made that it needs to be done. And I think the journals really need to emphasize that the data need to be displayed. I mean, with regard to the sex-specific studies related to reproductive health, et cetera, it's still the case if you look at studies overall in the last several years, it's really evened out. And I don't want to imply it's predominantly women. I just said majority women. And, I'd like to see, 50-50 or 51-49, a representative sample to be the norm. And we're getting pretty close to that now, particularly at the NIH where the policy enforces it.
If I may ask one other question.
You guys have had a big effect. I mean, it's things are changing.
That's great. So if one was studying lupus, for example, would it make sense for the FDA to say that the study should have should reflect the prevalence of the sexes in the population? So it's predominantly female. So should that study clinical trial also reflect that? That's just an example.
Well, there's a lot of discussion right now. I like to refer to representativeness 101, which is the basic level where I think we made a lot of progress. The 202 level, of course, so gets into the type of issues that you're describing as to whether we should be very disease specific and to replicate the demographics of the disease itself, or even in the case of medical products, replicate the population that the product is specifically intended for, because often the studies are done in people who are different than those who end up using the product, younger, more affluent, et cetera. So I think you raise an important issue, and it needs to be discussed and thought about. Personally, I think it's a pretty good idea to try to replicate the population for whom the trial is intended to inform as closely as you possibly can. But again, as we get to the 303 level course, if we take that as a strategy, then we have to ask the question, what does that mean globally? Because things look very different depending on where you are among the 7.8 billion people in the world. That's something I'm very aware of every day in my work at Google, where for the most part we're dealing with the entire global population.
And we've actually seen quite a few questions in the Q&A, which we will get to in a few minutes, around a few different diseases have been mentioned that I think will continue on that discussion around should the clinical trials more closely match the demographics of the intended ultimate users of new therapeutics and technologies. So I appreciate that discussion. So I do want to make sure that I get to a question I've got here specifically for Faz around there have clearly been barriers. I don't think that we can ignore that there have been bias and barriers to including women's issues and women's health and sex in research for a long time. We are making progress. I think the awareness is a great first step. The research is critical to help us understand where we are and where we're going, the numbers. But Faz, talk to us a little bit about how do we move forward and continue to make progress in removing some of this bias from what has traditionally held back the full potential of realizing outcomes in this area?
Well, first, again, Anula, Carolee, Nola, Rob, everyone's mentioned a lot of really important things here that this space has needed for quite some time. So there is an economic story here. There's a scientific story. There's funding that's really important. Representation is really important. And yes, it's evident the bias has been there. My approach to this question really revolves around one word, but it also revolves around some other subwords, if you would look at it that way. So the one word is mentorship or allyship, however you might want to look at it. A lot can be done by sharing of experiences, and I know everyone here on this panel, and most likely everyone on this call here, have done some level of mentorship. But there's a degree of desire by folks to bring science and IP to the marketplace, and yet there are so many complicated steps in between to doing that. Creating a business is different than creating intellectual property, and a business revolves around a product market fit, knowing that a consumer wants to purchase a product at a certain price and provide you with a profit margin. And there's so many steps in between that you can only gain either by doing it yourself and burning your fingers and it's time and money, or learning from the vastness of the wisdom that's here on this panel and in the audience as well. So mentorship, I think, plays a key role here, and finding the right allies. And then the subtopics on this, I would say, rely around collaboration, service, and I'm going to use a generic word that people may disagree with, but I would say grace, and I'll explain that in a moment. The collaboration has already been talked about. Carolee, Anula, Nola, that you've already mentioned how important it is that we have collaboration across the board, whether it's men, women, just across the board. Collaboration is really important. The service part of it ties into mentorship as well. Look, many of us who have gone through our educational process, through our career pathways, and have achieved whatever level of success that we are happy with, there's a level of service that we all need to consider giving back, or even pulling others forward. The grace part of it, I would also say, is important because, look, we really can't expect everyone to be a PhD or a medical doctor or a high-level CEO the moment that we meet them. The grace part of it comes in with giving everyone an opportunity to show what they're capable of doing. So I think in those general regards, while policy again is a big part of what I look at, yes, industries are created that way, and I do look to policy as a way of setting the roadmap for 10 years out. On an individual level, I think what we can all do is really try hard to focus on collaboration, service, grace, and pull people forward through mentorship.
You're muted, Jennifer.
Oh, Jennifer, you're muted.
Unmute. They keep muting me because they say there's feedback. So I unmuted myself. Thank you. That was such a lovely note to end on, and I think that we'll come back to that, Foz, with some of the questions I'm seeing actually in the Q&A about where to go and how to get started. So I wanted to just quickly, before we move into the Q&A, ask my panelists one final parting thoughts here in 3 words or less. So really think about that for a second, because I'm making you think on the spot here. What is the change you would like to see in the near term for women's health and inclusivity in research that pertains to the differences between the sexes? So I'm going to go back through the order I think we started with. So Nola, I'm going to start with you. Your 3 words to leave us with.
More women investors.
More women investors. I can definitely get behind that. That is an excellent one. Okay, Carolee.
Oh my goodness. Embrace women's collaboration and leadership. It's 4, but
Close enough. Good. That was great. Anula?
The business of women's health is ascendant and essential.
Also 5.
We're stretching our 3-word limit, but I'm not going to enforce that. That's okay. Rob?
Transparent representative participation. A lot of syllables, 3 words.
Good. That's a good one. And finally, Foz?
Nothing is impossible.
Oh, look at that. That was wonderful. Those were great. So thank you guys very much. We do have time for some Q&A, which I'm going to scroll through some of the great questions that have been coming across. I think the first one I'd like to pick up here is one I'm going to direct back to you, Foz, which is around, I've got ideas. Where do I start? Specifically, there's a woman in here with some great ideas. She's a physician, she's a scholar, she has some direct exposure to an area of health she'd like to make innovation in. What do I do is the question. So for the aspiring entrepreneurs in the audience, what advice do you have?
Thank you for asking me a question I can answer. So the NIH is the world's largest angel investor. And by the way, they also participate with the Angel Capital Association. They're wonderful folks. So that's one. VentureWell, Venture Capital Institute, I could go on and on. So the way to do it is to reach out to your network, right? So this is a people business. Find the people, look at all the people on this panel here. Find people who are willing to talk to you, find the right mentor, ask the questions, do the research, dig in. There are so many incredible programs across universities, across the country. High schools have them as well for becoming an entrepreneur. And you don't just wake up one morning and become one. There's a journey that you need to go through. So learn, read. I'm learning stuff all the time.
That's great. Other panelists want to jump in on this one? I love this question because it means that people have these raw ideas and they want to get started.
Collaboration with other people. Wherever you are, find collaborators. No one does a journey of entrepreneurship alone.
So I'm going to add one more thing, just as a really specific. VentureWell.org used to be called the National Collegiate Inventors and Innovators Alliance, but it's across all universities across the country. And they're .org, a nonprofit. There's a whole bunch of startup resources online. There's books, lots of resources available.
Yeah, another good one that I'll suggest for audience members is Springboard. Several of us are involved with that, which is a great organization. And for aspiring venture capitalists out there. There is a great group. There are several great groups, but two that I would point the audience to look at would be Venture Forward, which is a newer nonprofit as part of the MVCA that I'm involved with, that has VC University courses for those that want to learn more about the job of venture capital. And there are several others for those that want to start their career in that direction. This is great. Let's move into some of the questions that we touched on between Rob and Anula's conversation around representation in trials, and does that match the ultimate end user population that the technology is focused on? These are complicated, and Lupus is in here. It talks about, the overlay of not just women, but African Americans and other groups that are disproportionately impacted by certain diseases. I'd love to pick up on that thread and a little bit further, maybe hear from some of the other panelists as well. How do we ensure that we are running studies that are representative of the groups that need these technologies most? Anyone want to jump in from the panel?
Well, it's easy to ensure it if that's the policy that you want to have. The question, there are two really interesting and difficult questions that are part of this. So we're stuck right now when it comes to human studies. I like to call them human experiments because it just sharpens the mind that this is not a trivial, minor thing that we're talking about when we're developing a new treatment. Most of them don't work. 90% of drugs that, for example, that get into phase 1 clinical trials never make it to market because the risks outweigh the benefits. So we're stuck between seeing participation as an opportunity and a right versus a risk that someone needs to be protected from. And that, I think, is a dilemma that we're all still struggling with as we think about this overall issue. And the second is, sex and gender are not the only areas where this is really important. And, I would point to age right now as being one of the most important, because if you look at most medical therapies, for example, they're predominantly used in older people, and the trial populations are typically much younger. And a lot of that actually has to do with the first point I made. It's that there's a feeling that we need to protect older people more from the risks that are involved in clinical trials. So I know I'm not giving definitive short answers, but these are some of the issues that we need to think through.
I would also bring up the point that the majority of healthcare investors are men, and most of whom have little understanding of the significant gaps and the opportunities to enhance women's health. And this lack of investment means that new innovations that could be brought to market are overlooked or misunderstood. And that translates into a compromised health and wellness for women. So we just need to get more women investing, more women looking at the science, more women involved in the science, starting with using female mice.
Yes, this is always an interesting stat for people who aren't aware. Do you want to share with the audience who may not be aware that some of this goes back pretty far into the research chain?
Yeah, 90% of preclinical research done on animals are done on male mammals, male mice, because they do not want to involve estrogen and progesterone as a factor in their results. This means that the preclinical research is all geared toward what happens in a male mammal, and it's biased in the wrong direction. And I was asking yesterday a woman who gave me some research that she wanted me to fund, what was the difference between using male and female mice? And she said it was more expensive to get female mice. So if that's a cost that has to be borne by society, let's do it. There's really no reason to protect the fertility of female mice and miss the opportunity to see what happens in a progesterone estrogen system rather than just a testosterone-based system. Pretty adamant about that.
And I think these are great points. And, we talk about the players involved. Rob shared some of the stats. Statistically, around 1% to 2% of the drugs that are moving into the clinic are going to make it out and be a therapeutic on the other end. And so investors and companies are trying to optimize their probability of success. And if integrating other variables are the right thing to do for society, but lower your economic prospects, how do you make those trade-offs, and who needs to make those trade-offs? You know, does that need to be a policy decision? Or are for-profit businesses really going to optimize for something that ultimately introduces more risk to an already very risky proposition? I don't know if anyone in the audience wants to opine on that tension, frankly, that exists between trying to get drugs approved and trying to be as inclusive as possible in those studies.
Well,
I think you actually, go ahead.
I was just going to say it is a policy decision. If we decided as a society we wanted to require that preclinical studies be balanced, you know, just like the NIH did for clinical trials in human beings, it could be done. And so I think it's a very good and valid discussion to have about what the trade-offs would be, if any. I actually don't see that the cost, at least from my perspective, would be that much more. So it seems like one that might be a relatively easy one compared to some of the others I can think of.
Having been in pharma myself, the argument is made that in the clinical trial population, you want as much uniformity to get the best possible outcome. And so there's a tension, as you talked about bringing in the diversity, because that might make the signal less clear, which is a risk for pharma. And this is why I say the economics and the business really underpin a lot of what comes to the market as drugs and interventions, and society needs to understand that. Pharma is acting rationally because their mandate is to make returns for their investors, and that's what society has given them the mandate to do. So I think policy is needed to mitigate some of this and put some buffer around it.
Well, this is great. I think we will pause here because we've worked through a lot of the questions. I'll see if any of my panelists have any parting thoughts that they weren't able to squeeze into the discussion earlier. So let me just pause quickly and see if anybody else has some final thoughts they'd like to share with our audience before we wrap.
I'm sorry to be a loudmouth, but there was something I was supposed to talk about, and that is a very important thing, and that's the role of impact. And Faz talked about it in terms of service and giving back. And there is a big role for impact investors who are foundations, high net worth individuals, family offices, to come into this ecosystem and to be a little bit less concerned about the economics and the business case and the returns to boost the field. It has happened with the environment. It has happened in many other areas. And there's a big opportunity for impact investors to influence women's health and the products that come from it. And there is a fund there was a person from RIA, which is a fund focused on women's reproductive health, who was going to be on the panel, who isn't here. So I'm just highlighting that on behalf of RIA.
That's great. Yeah, another really important stakeholder group that makes this flywheel work is the role of impact investors and outside philanthropy, a huge source of funding for this space as well. So with that, I'm going to thank my panelists very much for joining today. Audience, I hope you enjoyed the session as much as I did, and thank you all very much for allowing me to participate with all of you today. So be well, and let's continue this discussion to make further advances.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.